In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. Islam Answers Atheism. Written by Asrar Rashid. Narrated by David Williamson. Published and presented by Rijl Publishing. Beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. George Bernard Shaw. Introduction. Reader, welcome. I urge you to read this book in its entirety. Do not judge this book until you have read it all. A book does not reveal everything until you have read it completely. You will not completely appreciate it until you read all of its chapters. Like the tesserae in a mosaic. Whenever you think something has not been answered or a point not clarified, you will find the answer and clarification further down, or in another chapter where that point will be more relevant. This book is the result of engagements with a vociferous and provocative collection of people, one could almost say a faction, called the New Atheists, in addresses at universities, mosques, churches, public areas, as well as in private homes and informal gatherings. New Atheism is on a crusade, a holy war, to dethrone its preconceived ideas of God, and indeed all religions. This book will show how these new atheist arguments use fallacy, strawman arguments, emotional content, and peculiar invective to disparage and denigrate. The book aims, in particular, to counter the propaganda peddled and perpetrated against Islam. After the Twin Tower attacks in New York on September 11, 2001, Islam was assaulted from all sides for being the doctrine of a law-giving God. Outdated notions were resuscitated into an anti-Islam toolkit to combat those perceived as Islamic zombies, and new arguments were re-injected from the armaments of secular humanism and anti-theism. Islam was declared as the greatest force for evil. Propaganda became the key tool to malign, denigrate, mock, deride, and patronize religion and religious people, perpetrated not less than in the spirit of Goebbels' Third Reich, Reichspropaganda-Liter. Propaganda has no principles of its own. It has only one goal, and in politics, that goal is always to conquer the masses. Any means to that end is good, and any means that does not serve that end is bad. The entire polemical argument against Islam is encapsulated in the following exaggerated vitriol. A superstitious, Jew-hating, violent religion that kills innocents, enslaves free people, that has a totalitarian, homophobic, misogynistic law that oppresses women, and uses draconian punishments like amputation and stoning. A sentiment especially echoed by Richard Dawkins, who unabashedly tweeted, "Haven't read Qur'ān, so couldn't quote chapter and verse like I can for Bible, but often say Islam greatest force for evil today." This primitive fossil and zoologist is the ostensive leader of New Atheism, an academic who has not read the Qur'ān, yet in a louche, imperialist, orientalist style, Richard Dawkins writes the word Qur'ān with the outdated spelling of Quran, judging Islam to be the greatest force for evil. Indeed, it would be strange if such sentiments were ever expressed for his former associate, Jeffrey Epstein, or the rabid atheist and physicist Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss not only received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Epstein for funding his science project, even after the latter was convicted of heinous crimes against humanity, but was also forced to resign from the University of Arizona in 2018 after allegations of gross misconduct were made by women at his university. These are people who flaunt themselves as defenders of women's and children's rights against religion, or any other real or perceived infringement on basic humanity. Yet if any misconduct, carried out by an adherent of any faith, in particular Islam, is identified, then the entire faith will be their target. Excuse this author for any ostensible sniping or quoting of headlines for maximum effect, as this is done only to exemplify something of the noxiousness flung by New Atheism. If it is thought that this will merely increase their diatribe, then I suggest that this only reflects a lack of experience in the argumentation of this demagogic assemblage. Is belief in God a danger to civilization? More specifically, is Allah, along with the teachings of Islam, a threat to human progress or to Western civilization? Such were the incendiary premises that led the shameless propaganda, forwarded by what has become to be known as New Atheism, that exploded onto the public scene in what was termed an atheist revolution, fanned by verbose but hollow arguments in popular atheist paperbacks. New Atheism was the political tool which justified wars abroad, furthering secular values into places deemed anachronistically religious, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. That the Iraqi regime was self-identified as secular was not stated when Christopher Hitchens, author of the book God is Not Great, wrote, "I think it's us, plus the 82nd Airborne and the 101st, who are the real fighters for secularism at the moment, the ones who are really fighting the main enemy." This was said as part of the backdrop to Hitchens' support of the invasion of Iraq, on the unsubstantiated pretext of it having weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam's alleged support of al-Qaeda, both false claims, as became quite clear from the intelligence gathered once the invasion had taken place. This invasion by the so-called real fighters for secularism into a region where Christians, Muslims, and other minorities coexisted allowed it to become a tinderbox and killing ground for warring factions and sectarianism. Hitchens, who later would die of cancer, did not mention that the U.S. jets and ground force fired nearly 10,000 rounds of depleted uranium, DU, in heavily populated civilian areas in 2003 alone. Depleted uranium, attractive to weapons designers for its extreme hardness and ability to pierce armor, is a chemically toxic and radioactive heavy metal. 300,000 DU rounds were estimated to have been fired during the 2003 Iraq War, the vast majority by U.S. forces. A total of 782,414 DU rounds were believed to have been fired during the first Gulf War in 1991, mostly by U.S. forces again. However, less than 7% of the weapons used in that conflict were smart, as the Pentagon admitted long after the war. 70% of the 88,500 bombs dropped on Iraq and Kuwait, the equivalent of 7 Hiroshimas, fell on populated areas. It was claimed Iraq's launch sites for Scud missiles were knocked out, when in fact, not a single one was. None of this was reported at the time. Journalists, lied to, accepted those lies and passed them on to the public. Although he was the most cultured amongst the Four Horsemen of New Atheism, Hitchens was a journalist and a militant atheist. His sentiments and his support for war abroad resembles something that Winston Churchill said about Kurds and others when Britain divided the Ottoman Muslim territories. I do not understand the squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. The labels and methods may have changed, but the policies against Islam and the Muslims are the same. Let it be borne in mind that dum-dum bullets, concentration camps, the Bolshevik revolutions and communist ideology, Nazism, the extermination of the Native Americans and the Aborigines, nuclear warheads and subsequent strikes against Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were all non-Islamic in origin. Has much changed since then? If we read up on things such as the Iraq sanctions, the use of depleted uranium weapons in Iraq, the millions of children dead, the invasion of Libya, weapons being sold by the US and UK to Saudi Arabia to kill people in places like Yemen, the biggest humanitarian crisis today, and the historical support for brutal dictators like General Suharto, who killed millions, we realize nothing much has changed. The world is much more intricate and complex today, including the Muslim majority countries, for such a simpleton approach in blaming Islam and its 1400-year-old civilization. The Pope of New Atheism is without doubt Richard Dawkins, a renowned evolutionary biologist and social media troll who once wrote, "Listening to the lovely bells of Winchester, one of our great medieval cathedrals. So much nicer than the aggressive-sounding Allahu Akbar. Or is it just my cultural upbringing?" From his many atrocious tweets, one of the most horrendous was, "With respect to those meanings of human that are relevant to the morality of abortion, any fetus is less human than an adult pig." This inhumane, immoral, unethical, and bigoted attitude of New Atheism leadership is mirrored by Sam Harris and his attitude to race, genetics, and intelligence. Sam Harris deliberated the findings of Charles Murray, co-author of The Bell Curve, which controversially posited a genetic basis for the perceived difference between the IQs of the black and white races. Sam framed the issues Murray had raised in the following way. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Now, for better or worse, these are all facts. In fact, there is almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims about IQ, about the validity of testing for it, about its importance in the real world, about its heritability, and about its differential expression in different populations. Again, this is what a dispassionate look at what decades of research suggests. Unfortunately, the controversy over the bell curve did not result from legitimate, good-faith criticisms of its major claims. Rather, it was the product of a politically correct moral panic that totally engulfed Murray's career and has yet to release him. Such Ku Klux Klan-type narratives can easily misappropriate the science of the saintly Richard Dawkins, who tells us the science of eugenics is correct, even though heaven forbid we should do it. Richard Dawkins's tweets ran, "It's one thing to deplore eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It's quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology." Then he clarifies with, "For those determined to miss the point, I deplore the idea of a eugenic policy. I simply said deploring it doesn't mean it wouldn't work. Just as we breed cows to yield more milk, we could breed humans to run faster or jump higher, but heaven forbid that we should do it." And with, "A eugenic policy would be bad. I'm combating the illogical step from X would be bad to so X is impossible. It would work in the same sense as it works for cows. Let's fight it on moral grounds. Deny obvious scientific facts and we lose, or at best derail, the argument." Richard Dawkins's sentiments remind me of Alfred Hitchcock's American psychological crime film, Rope, where the killers, Brandon and Philip, justify their horrendous crime using the reasoning of their housemaster, Rupert, even though he would not endorse any acting upon his philosophy. Not unsimilarly, misguided people may only too well utilize the housemaster Dawkins's science for eugenics. The fact is that the atheist compass is unstable in terms of ethics and morality, and can vary according to situation and era. This leads to a dystopian society. Islam, in contrast, provides basic universal laws that govern all human morality in any place and time, that safeguard against any moral conundrums. However, New Atheism would have us believe that Islam is a type of fideism that assaults human reason and undermines the rational mind. In 6 chapters, this book disproves this claim. Read patiently, as each chapter interconnects like a link in a chain. While reading the first chapter, you may feel certain things are being left out, but as you proceed, you will find what you were looking for in its appropriate place. Chapter 1 is an overview of the role of reason in the Islamic faith, the Qur'ān's encouragement of rationale and condemnation of blind faith, before looking at the early development of rational theology and the Kalām science, the dialectical method used against heresy, and including atheism. Chapter 2 is an excursion into the epistemology of the Kalām methodology, to derive knowledge and arrive at certainty regarding any given fact. This chapter also delves into common material fallacies and a summary of other philosophies which are in contradistinction to Islam and subscribed to by many atheists knowingly or unknowingly. Chapter 3 starts by unraveling skepticism, with specific reference to David Hume and earlier Hellenistic philosophy. Then it moves to the specific proofs for God. This chapter concludes by considering the innumerable signposts to God, anything from Fibonacci numbers to a snowflake. Chapter 4 delves into the problem of evil, human free will, and other deep philosophical objections to God. Of special interest is an in-depth analysis of Stephen Fry's controversial interview regarding God and evil. Chapter 5 is a response to the claims made regarding Islam's position on science and scientific objections against the Qur'ān and Ḥadīth, concluding with a rational approach to the hotly contested topic on evolution theory. Chapter 6 looks at the historicity of the Qur'ān, Ḥadīth, and the most widely debated subjects surrounding Sharia law, like jihad, slavery, punishments, and human rights. This book will especially benefit atheists and detractors of Islam, at the very least by sophisticating the discussion on Islam when engaging with learned Muslims. Let us hope that Muslims and atheists engage in dialogue and debate, at least with an in-depth knowledge and understanding of Kalām, philosophy, and science, and that this book becomes a means to achieving that goal.